Hi everyone, this is Josie and I am here to talk to you about the treatment of immigrants in the sugar industry as well as the child labor in the sugar industry. So when we say everything sweet ain't sugar-coated, this is the part where we really mean it. The sugar industry brought a lot of despair and exploitation to its workers. The industry relied on Mexican immigrants to do heavy work that white Americans did not want to do, but they were still treated horribly. They had restrictions on where they could shop, what they could buy, and where they could live, and where they were able to get housing, their living conditions were not healthy. This also included a social aspect of sugar consumerism, where the poor and the immigrants were known to eat brown, unrefined sugar, and the upper and middle class white Americans were consuming refined white sugar. So it played a very prominent role in your social class and your everyday lives and just what kind of sugar you ate. During the fight for child labor laws and better working conditions, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, along with any other race besides white workers and children, were excluded until the 1920s. In order to appeal to people and excite outrage about the current situations, they photographed and focused on white children and workers. April Merlot says in Sugar and Civilization that Lewis Hines' photographs aimed to excite viewers' sentiments. He focused on working children's white bodies, their dirty clothes, and their sweet faces. Lewis Hine only made close-up portraits of white children, shots whose intimacy invited white middle-class viewers to make comparisons to their own precious children. He repeatedly photographed children holding large knives, which evoked bloody fingers and knees and were intended to alarm outrage. In 1924, Texas Congressman John C. Boggs wanted to extend the immigrant restrictions to Mexicans as well. The National Origins Act didn't directly limit immigrations, but it did impose a literacy test and a head tax. But Boggs wanted to actually exclude Mexicans altogether and put further restrictions on them, including the number of immigrants that were allowed into the U.S., which is kind of ironic because of the simple fact that the U.S. brought Mexicans over specifically to work in the beet fields, and now they wanted them out and for them to have further restrictions on even coming into the U.S. They made up most of the workforce in the sugarcane and beet fields and the factories as well. And the beet farmers said that without them, they would no longer be able to grow beets because they will perform the tasks that white laborers would not. So it was essential to keep them and not impose restrictions, further restrictions. They lobbied for a higher sugar tariff, but they just did not want their supply of workers to be taken away from them. So another part of this is the working conditions in the sugar factories, along with the living conditions. The working conditions were not good. They were just as treacherous. Women who dipped candy had infections on their hands. People were overworked and underpaid. Children were working in factories with dangerous equipment that was not regulated. And it was advertised as great work that even white women wanted to do, particularly young white women in their early 20s. But underneath it all, were the same problems that were experienced in the fields and with children and immigrants. Which leads us to the fight for anti-child labor laws in the sugar industry. Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants were not the only cheap labor that farmers could find. They also exploited children. At first, child labor in agriculture was seen as an opportunity for children to get healthful, fresh air, physical activity, and parental guidance. It wasn't until the 1910s that the first study into child labor in agriculture took place. At that point, they revealed what was really going on in the fields. They worried that premature labor burdened children's bodies and deprived them of education, which they feared would cause Anglo-Saxon racial degeneration. The farmers saw cheap labor as a way to put off advancing and investing in technology, which was considered a loathsome expense. And they also saw child labor as a way to compete against lower cost of tropical cane producers. Lobbyists that were against anti-child labor laws said that such amendments would prohibit farm families from acquiring chores and farm help from their children, thus interfering with states' and families' rights, while lobbyists for anti-child labor laws argued that children deserve federal protection because their own families had failed them. The USDA saw labor as a benefit on the large scale rather than on a small scale from individual to individual like the child labor law reformers. They appealed to the public, just like I said before, by advertising and putting photographs of white children in the media. And in 1915, the first study about child labor in the sugar beet fields was published. And in 1923, women and children went to the streets to protest and participated in sugar boycott. So consuming sugar was painted as cannibalism in the media, and they continued with their notion of innocent childhood being exploited by greedy, profit-hungry corporations. The only time that they photographed Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants was in front of their own house, like a family photo in front of their house. They never showed close-ups of them in the fields in order to appeal to the white public and evoke outrage and try to get change to happen, just like I said before. So eventually, the Colorado Agricultural College conducted joint studies with the NCLC on child labor in the beet fields, which gave the fight added authority and credibility. The conditions in the sugarcane fields were not seen as major as the beet fields, so the sole focus was on the beet fields for the time being. And eventually, all of this work led to having limitations on child labor, but not eradicating it until much later in 1938.